What's going on, everybody? This is Gary B. Jr., your media consultant. Today we're going to be talking about camera terms and definitions, and I'm going to ultimately give you the Gary version for terms that usually are going to be confusing if you don't have a background in video, film, or photography. But today you're going to understand it better than you ever have. Even if you do have a background in those areas, hopefully this makes sense. If it doesn't, leave a comment in the description below, or leave a comment below, not in the description. I'll take care of that part. But leave a comment below. Let me know what you think would be a better way to describe it in the way that makes sense to most people. All right, so first off, I'm looking at my notes here, so I'm just going off of that to make sure we don't miss anything. But aperture. This is one that you'll see a lot on mirrorless / hybrid cameras. And for the most part, that's what most people are going to be using. So DSLRs, mirrorless hybrid cameras, and we have this idea of aperture. And aperture is literally something that you have to have a lens to experience. Now, you do change the setting in the camera, but it literally is changing everything in the lens. It's not doing anything outside of the lens itself. And so you have to pay for it. The better your lens, the lower the aperture number, the F number, right? So f1.4 is going to be more expensive than an f5.6 lens. All right, so the smaller the number, the more valuable it is. All right, now what does that number represent? I'm giving you the Gary version. That number represents how much light the lens can take in. All right, so ultimately there's something in it that actually is getting bigger and smaller in terms of the opening of the lens as you change that aperture. The lower numbers open it up wider, the bigger numbers make it close down smaller. Both of them are helpful and useful for their own use cases. However, lenses that have a low aperture, the expensive ones that we're talking about, they still will be able to go to a higher aperture number in terms of like f16 or f22 without a problem. What you're looking for is how does it perform at its lowest aperture number, right? So at f1.4 or f2.8. And this dictates how much light it allows in, okay, and that the camera actually reads. Now, there is another type of reading that you'll see in cinema that's called T-stops instead of f-stops. Same idea, is still based on the lens. However, it's not based on the T-stops. I believe it's based on what the sensor actually sees as opposed to what the lens actually lets in. So this is a small difference, but it's major because it allows you to be more consistent with those cameras with the cinema lineups that have the T-stops, because they're going to be more consistent across the board, where cameras that are mirrorless cameras, DSLR cameras, those are going to be inconsistent in comparison. When you take a 2.8 lens that's a 50 millimeter and you compare it to a camera that is a 200 millimeter, the f2.8 is going to look a little bit different in terms of how much light it lets in. And that's just expected across the board. But in cinema, that's unacceptable, right? So they use T-stops. But if you're looking to understand aperture, it dictates how much light the lens can let in. It's all based on the lens, but it also dictates the amount of background blur that you're going to have. To some degree, it's a part of the equation. Let me put it that way. And so if you want to have a lot of background blur, then you want to get a lens that has a low f-stop or T-stop, right? So 1.2, 1.4, 1.8. Those are really good low f-stops. In this case is what I'll keep talking about mostly is f-stop. If you have a lens that has a low f-stop, you have a better chance of getting background blur than you would if you had a camera, or a lens I should say, that had f3.5 as its minimal f-stop or aperture. Same way if you got a lens that's the minimum f-stop is 11, right, which is a possibility. If you plan on doing a lot of shots outdoors, 11 is fine, right? And you're shooting up in the sky, nothing's wrong with f11. But if you're indoors doing an event, f11 is a no-go. No matter what kind of camera you have, no matter what kind of lens you have, you don't want to be at f11 as your primary aperture. So this is a major part of what people would consider the quality of the lens. And so the lower the aperture number, you're going to find that those lenses are going to usually be more expensive. And if they're not more expensive, they're still going to be better for you to use in low light situations and in portrait situations. A lot of portrait photographers like to use lower f-stops because they want to have their subject separated from the background. With that low f-stop, it allows more room for the background blur. Now, there's other facets that play a part in that. So if you're looking to try to get greater background blur, the focal distance plays a big part in that. So the closer you can get to your subject, the more you'll separate them from the background in comparison to how close they are to the background. So right now, for example, I'm not that far from my background. It's about 2 arm lengths away, but I'm also about 2 arm lengths away from my camera right now. And so the background blur is not going to be as dramatic as if I were to scoot everything away from the background and I'm twice as close to the camera than I was to the background. You'll see it drastically change, all right, to where it'll be more blurry because distance plays a part in that background blur that people love, and that's a big deal. And then also the type of camera that you have. If you have a full frame camera, which is another term, full frame, those cameras will produce background blur without as much distance needed between the lens and the background or the subject and the background. All right, so the lens to the subject and then the subject to the background. Those aspects of it play a big part in how much background blur you're going to have. All right, let's look at another term. We talked about aperture. It dictates your how well it performs in low light, but also the background blur. Right. Next one is the shutter. The shutter is something that you see a lot, and you hear that term in photography as the shutter speed. Okay, and so shutter speed in video is usually going to be considered like a shutter angle. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to, and ultimately the idea with the shutter has to do with how long the sensor is exposed for the image. All right, and so if the sensor is exposed for a short amount of time, right, then it's going to have less room for the subject to blur. And I say blur meaning how much motion the subject has. So if the subject is moving around and doing a lot going on all in front of them, or maybe they're playing basketball or football or racing cars or whatever it is, and the subject is moving quickly, then you're going to want your shutter to actually move quicker as well so it can kind of freeze that action. Now, there are times when you don't want your shutter to be fast. For example, if you're taking a photo, for example, of cars, and or even a video, you can do the same thing for video, but you want to get this image of cars at night driving under the overpass. You're capturing this highway shot or this image of a road, and cars are going this way and they're coming that way and they're going back and forth, and you want to have that that trail light, that red light and white light sweeping through your frame. Then you want to have a low shutter speed, and that low shutter speed, it keeps the sensor exposed for a longer period of time. All right, and what that means is that light can travel from here to there across your frame because the sensor was open that long, so it looks like a blur. It looks like it's blurry, and that can be very pleasing for photography, especially. You've probably seen those photos in doctors' offices or in meeting halls and things like that that have this blur of a highway. Everything is crispy except the lights look like a streak through the image. Okay, that's because they lowered the shutter speed to where it was slow. That means it was open for a long time and then it closed. All right, and usually it's going to go up and down or something like that and open up and close, but that's what the shutter dictates. It dictates how much blur is going to be captured from your subject based on their movement. So if your subject is standing still, super still, your shutter won't really make that big of a difference. However, in cinema, they actually do prefer for there to be some type of motion blur. So they'll shoot at a shutter speed of 24 frames per second. All right. If you were to try to take a picture at 24 frames per second, it would be difficult. All right. It would be pretty difficult to do something like that. So what they do is they'll make the shutter, and I take that back. I said earlier they do it at 24 frames per second. So they want it to capture at 24 frames per second. Their shutter is usually going to be twice that. Okay, so they'll have the shutter at 48. Okay, some DSLRs don't let you do that, so you'll do it at 50 frames per second, or 1 over 50. 1 over 50 is 1/50th of a second ultimately. All right, and so that shutter speed is based on seconds. And so any number you see, if I say 1/50th, that's 1/50th of a second. 1/20th, that's 120th of a second. You can go up sometimes when you're trying to sync up with your flash. I've got some cameras that the flash sync speed is at 320, 3/20th of a second, and then I've got others, or I've seen others that are at 1/60th of a second. And so each camera is going to dictate for the flash sync. The shutter speed is important for that. However, for video, which I'm primarily focused on, I would say that you want to keep it to where you double whatever your frames per second that you're shooting. All right. And so if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, then double your shutter speed to be at 1/50th or 1/48th of a second. If you have a camera that allows you to do a shutter angle, then you want to just make it be 180 degrees. All right. 180, and you can set it and forget it, because no matter what you change your frames per second to, you're shooting at 60 frames per second, it's always going to be 180 degrees from that, which is double. Okay. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, it's just going to be double. The camera that I use, I set my shutter angle to be 180 degrees, and I don't even think about it anymore. However, if I were using a traditional DSLR or even traditional mirrorless cameras, you'll see that they'll have the shutter speed, and you got to consciously consider how to make it be double whatever your frame rate is that you're recording in for your videos. All right, so that's important for that in terms of understanding what the shutter does. Hopefully that sheds some light on it to make sure that you're setting it properly, because there are some creative reasons that you want to set it uniquely, and then there's the traditional way of doubling the frame rate, basically. All right, so that's what shutter is about, and that's the Gary version of it, is double your frame rate unless you're trying to use it for a creative purpose, and or use it at 180 degrees if your camera supports it. All right, our next topic here is ISO. All right, so ISO, sometimes you hear people call it ISO. I don't really care. It doesn't matter as long as you know what you're talking about. So ISO is the sensitivity that your sensor will have to light. All right, I used to think of it as fake light, but it really is just amplifying the sensitivity to the light. All right, now why is that important? Amplifying your sensitivity to light allows you to be in a darker environment, but boost your camera's sensitivity, or your lens, not your lens, but your sensor's sensitivity to light, to where it looks like it's not as dimly lit or as dark as it looks to your human eye. All right, and so ISO or ISO will allow you to change your camera's sensitivity. When you're shooting at night, that's important because it's not a lot of light, so you want your camera to be sensitive to it so it can actually capture the subject that's probably not a light bulb, but you want them to be seen. So you might have some light, or you're using moonlight, stars, or whatever it is. You want to make sure your camera can capture your subject, so you'll make your ISO be a little bit brighter or a little bit higher. All right. If you're shooting photography and you're trying to catch or capture the aurora borealis, right, the northern lights, you got to turn your ISO way up in order for it to capture through your camera and your lens what those northern lights look like. Because as easy as your eyes can see them, your camera is not as sensitive as your eyes, or doesn't have the same dynamic range as your eyes do to capture light. And so you want to turn the ISO up when it has to be a sensitive, when it's low light situations, but you want to capture something that is visibly there to your human eye, but may not be visibly there to your actual camera sensor. Now, we talked earlier about the aperture. The lower your aperture can go in terms of a 1.4, 1.2, the easier or the less you'll have to rely on your ISO. Because as you turn up the sensitivity to light, you also are introducing a sensitivity to the noise. All right, and that noise could be color noise. It could be grain, in terms of just it looks grainier overall as an image, because it's more sensitive to all the light and all the pores of your skin and all the fabrics of your shirts and whatever the background is. All those things are going to be more sensitive to the light. My rule of thumb is keep your ISO as low as you possibly can without missing your shot. Okay, and so do everything you can with your shutter speed, do everything you can with your aperture, and then if you have to, adjust your ISO to make sure you don't miss your shot. And that's an indoor shot, outdoors, it doesn't matter. I would make your ISO be your last resort when it comes to making changes, changing settings in your camera for you to capture what you're trying to capture. All right, so ISO is the last resort. I've got my ISO set to a knob or a wheel in the back of my camera to where I can turn it up as needed. All right, now some cameras have a dual ISO, okay, dual ISO setting to where it can function very cleanly. So we talked about that noise being introduced to it because it's more sensitive to light. Some cameras have a dual gain sensor to where it'll actually not reflect increased noise when you go to that second ISO, which is a lot higher in the ISO range. So it might be 400 is the base ISO, and then the second ISO might be at 2000. All right, and they both will look similar, okay, to where there won't be much noise introduced, but you have much more sensitivity to your light in those situations. So some people set their cameras and they have settings in their cameras that allow them to just switch between those two base ISOs or those dual gain ISO options, right? So from 400 to 2000, and that's pretty much all they go to because that's going to get them the cleanest image or the cleanest shot through their camera sensor. All right, so keep that in mind. Focus on your aperture, getting the good quality, best quality lens you can afford, because you got to pay for aperture. Then you focus on your shutter speed. That dictates how you want the creativity of your shot to look, along with aperture because it dictates the background. But your shutter dictates how much is your subject going to be frozen in time. How fast are you trying to make that sensor be exposed to light to capture what's there? All right. If you've seen a lot of things that are moving a lot, sports, action, whatever it may be, you know, gymnastics or even animals, right? Animals that move quickly, you want to have a very high shutter speed because you don't want those animals to look like a blur in your image for photography or videography, okay? You want to make sure if you're using it for video, then you're doing the 180-degree rule to where you're doubling whatever your frames per second are, right? So if you shoot at 60 frames per second, then make your shutter be 120, all right? And then when it comes to the ISO, adjust that last to make sure you don't miss the shot. You got your aperture where you want, you got your shutter where you need it to be, and then you adjust your ISO accordingly to make sure you don't miss the shot. To approach it with all the creativity that you have, right? So whatever you want creatively to be expressed, this is where you get to finalize that look, okay? With those three settings alone, you can get a lot of different looks, a lot of different effects, just a lot of cool things. When you watch movies, you'll notice that sometimes when someone is inebriated, right? Maybe they're in a dream world, or maybe they've been drugged, or whatever it may be, not to cause any trauma, but there's a lot of things that can happen in a movie to have a reason to slow down the shutter, all right? And so they'll have that dream state feel, or that less than reality or greater than reality feel, I guess, to where things are blurry and moving and so forth and so on. They've literally just slowed down the shutter, okay? They made the shutter speed not be double. They made it be less than that, all right? And so it's closer to the actual frames per second, or even less than the frames per second that they're shooting at. So if they're shooting at 24 frames per second, their shutter might be at 10 or 12 or 16 or whatever it may be below the frames per second, or right at 24. All right, so that's what those are the main three things that you're going to see on almost any camera. In my next video, I'm going to talk about some other things that you may not see in any camera.